Welcome.
Okay, I'm going to do something that one should really not do to start a talk, and that is to apologize. A couple of things. The dogs woke me up at about 2 a.m. last night, insisting that they had to go outside, and they did. And then, of course, they always wake me up at about 6:30 in the morning because they want to go back outside again. And then this afternoon, I spent my day clearing brush, pulling up bittersweet and multiflora rose and other odds and ends. So why get involved in edible wild plants? Maybe I should apologize for another thing, which is that normally I do a talk like this, and it's a little bit of a show and tell, where I bring things with me so you can actually touch and see things. And also there's kind of a feedback that occurs with a group where you know whether you're telling people things that they already know. Basically, what I'm going to do is sort of an introduction to edible wild plants, which many of you may already be familiar with, and then get on to some recommendations of things that you might want to look for this coming season, or this season even. So why collect edible wild plants? Why forage? The overriding and simplest answer is it's fun. Beyond that, you can come up with all sorts of rational reasons why this is a really good thing to do. And also, I'm going to apologize for looking at my notes because I'm a little loopy right now. Well, you can survive on edible wild plants if you wish to do so, but basically, you almost have to spend all your waking moments foraging in order to do that. I don't really feel like going back to the Mesolithic period. So for me, foraging has always been kind of a casual and opportunistic endeavor. I'm more interested in what's out there now, how to find it. Sometimes I'm looking for something specifically, and sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I just come across things. So you can save money, of course, because these are, after all, free. It's just a matter of expenditure of effort. There are a number of things that could be considered superfoods. For example, rose hips supply much more vitamin C than oranges. Something like a hazelnut, actually pound per pound, contains more protein than a hen's egg. So they can be considered superfoods in that sense. Also, in the sense that we're so used to, I mean, if you buy a prepared food, you've lost a lot of the nutritive value of that food. If you go to the supermarket, that fresh produce that you're collecting there has been sitting there for a while, both in transit and also sitting on the shelves. So it's lost a certain amount of its nutritive value in that process. With foraging, you basically are going directly to the source. There is usually not a lot of time between when you collect and when you prepare. And in addition to that, you have choice where you can choose where and when you collect, the quality of the material that you're collecting. So there are benefits in that sense. Really, foraging is more about the soul than the stomach. Thoreau at some point said something to the effect, and this is not a direct quote, but it said at some point that those who spend all their time indoors achieve a kind of a craziness. And since we've all gone through COVID, we can all agree with that there is a certain amount of separation from things that occurs when you spend so much time indoors and isolated. Foraging gets you outdoors. It's one of its great benefits. I think there were studies that in hospitals that showed that patients were faster to recover if they had contact with the out of doors, or even if they could see a tree outside the window, it seemed to aid the healing process. So foraging gets you out there. It gets you more in tune. This is, by the way, as an aside, this is a benefit for children if you forage with children. And there is, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, the nature deficit disorder that seems to have occurred with kids these days, where they spend so much time inside dealing with artificial environments that they get out of touch with what's outside. My wife and I lived on a farm. We sold it a couple of years ago, but we lived on a farm in southeastern Pennsylvania that was about 30 acres, and we had various things planted on the acreage. The upper field was planted in alfalfa hay, and but it was very poor alfalfa hay. It had mostly grass. And not long after we moved in, we encountered a neighbor who was along our back fence, and he was with his son, and they're sort of leaning over the fence, and we started to chat about, just introducing ourselves and talking about this and that. And at some point, the guy asked, "Well, what are you growing here?" And I said, "Well, we have some corn down below, and we have some alfalfa hay here." And he looked at me and he said, "Hay is from grass?" And that's sort of an indicator of how people have gotten removed from the out of doors. You're never really closer to nature than when you are foraging, because it's a very direct back and forth between you and whatever you're trying to collect. It's why I got into it, as a matter of fact. Years ago, I was a camp counselor in Maine, and I was teaching natural history. I was also teaching woodcraft skills. I mean, how to make a wet day fire, that kind of thing. And it was right about the time that Ewell Gibbons came out with Stalking the Wild Asparagus. And it was also about the time that my father had put out a field guide to wildflowers for the northeastern part of the country. And it seemed like a natural thing to do, to combine the two books. And it formed an incredibly useful teaching tool for kids who were just so about the out of doors and learning something about natural history. There was this direct connection that they would get. If they knew they could use something that they were looking at, all of a sudden it had real significance for them. So that's how I began. That's how I got into it. And so one of the benefits, why else go into this? One is that there are certain flavors that are much more intense on things that you forage from the out of doors. Good examples, and good examples would be something like strawberries, where we basically have bred the flavor out of strawberries in order to make them larger and more uniform. The same thing happened. You can see it happening with tomatoes. It's why people have gotten back into heirloom tomatoes, is because we managed to breed out some of the flavors that were so wonderful about the heirloom varieties, so that we would have a tomato that was sort of uniform. It would ripen at the same time. It was about the same size here and there, and looked perfect. We lost the flavor. The other thing is, one of the great joys for me about foraging has always been that it's kind of a seasonal, ephemeral thing, where you can't just go into the supermarket any old day and get what you find in the out of doors. A lot of these things don't have long shelf lives. A really prime example of that one would be something that they're trying to breed to be commercial, but have not yet to achieve it, and that would be something like pawpaws. I don't know how many of you have experienced pawpaws, but it's our largest Native American fruit. Trees that produce fruit produce piles of it, but it's certainly in our area here, it's only available in the first couple of weeks of October. And so if you want pawpaws, that's when you have to go, not before that and not after that. So pretty much you can forage anywhere. Um, there's It doesn't matter whether you're in your garden, whether you're on your back 40, whether you're in Manhattan. You can forage for edibles almost everywhere. Years ago, I did a radio program with some chefs in Brooklyn, and that was basically the subject: is what can we forage for here in the city? And it turned out there were all sorts of things. There's a whole group of plants that are called or can be called cosmopolitan weeds. And basically they've followed us around the planet because they're designed to colonize disturbed soil situations. They are the precursors to, everything else. Good examples of plants like that would be, well, a good example would be dandelions. This is a plant that it's a biennial. In essence, it will send up a low rosette of leaves the first year, and then its flower the next year, and is everywhere. Things like chicory are like that. Some of my favorite plants are things that you would find in seriously disturbed soil situations. Things like lamb's quarters, which is Chenopodium, which is a spinach substitute, but it isn't that strong flavor of spinach. It's a very mild flavor. It's prepared exactly the same way. It reduces on cooking and this and that. And with just a little bit of butter, it's wonderful. Amaranth is the same sort of thing. Amaranth actually came out of Central America originally, where they were improving it to a certain degree to have heavier seed heads. But both the leaves and the seeds, the leaves, again, is a spinach substitute. The seeds is kind of a black bread. And actually, lamb's quarters is the same sort of thing. There are a series of plants that were cosmopolitan weeds that were very common around habitation that were used a lot at one time in the human history, but have basically gone out of disfavor. Those are two of them. Other things like nettles is something that went out of favor, and it's a wonderful thing to prepare. The collecting of it is a bit chancy, but the cooking of it is easy. It reduces the stinging hairs on the stinging nettle get reduced in hot water in the space of about 30 seconds, and then it makes great soup. So that's another one. So what do you need to know about collecting edible wild plants once you've decided that, well, why not? I guess the first thing we'll talk about is safety, just because why not? It's probably the first item of equipment that you should have is a good field guide. For me, it was a combination of the Peterson Field Guide to Wildflowers in the Northeast and Yoel Gibbons' book. You could also get this book, which is the one that I produced. But it's essentially a combination of the two. And frankly, when I have difficult or issues with identification, and I need a little bit more information to make a finer, work a little bit at deciding whether this is such and such or a lookalike, I'll go to the wildflower guide to look at stuff. Normally I don't have to do that, but every once in a while it's handy. So the first thing you should know about collecting edible wild plants is don't eat something you can't identify. I mean, these are no-brainer, very common sense things to know. So don't eat something you can't identify. Don't eat a plant because you remember having heard that it was edible. Go back to your source and find out which part of that plant is edible and when. A really good example of a pitfall that you can get into on that score is pokeweed is one of those plants that most people, and certainly anyone who's been in the outdoors, recognizes is, well, that's poke salad. Yeah, we eat that. We pickle that. We do this and that. But poke salad or pokeweed is also ranked as perhaps the most common plant that folks in poison control centers encounter as an issue with somebody who's come in with a poisoning problem. It's ranked as one of the more dangerous plants. For an adult, you're just going to get a little sick. It's a heavy cathartic. But for a child, particularly a young child, it could be a real problem. So pokeweed is one of those things that you need to know that you only gather it when it's about 6 or 7 inches tall. You need to peel off any reddish outer portion of it, and you need to prepare it properly. It brings up an issue with vitamins. This is kind of an aside. Just now, maybe I'll mention it later. So anyway, know what you're eating, know when to eat it, and how to eat it. There's some families of plants that I tend to be very cautious about. There's one family that basically I don't really deal with, except in special circumstances, and that's the umbellifers, what are they called these days? The Apiaceae, the carrot family. And they produce umbrella-like clusters of little tiny flowers. Wild carrot is any one of the fields that you'll go into, you'll see wild carrot. It is the precursor. It is what we developed the modern carrot from. So it has that flavor of a carrot. It's kind of scrawny. It's very fibrous. It's not really plump. And when I use it, and I don't use it very often, I tend to use it as a flavoring agent, and I tend to put it into a mesh bag and just put it into a soup or stew and get the flavor, but not actually use the plant. However, a close relative, of course, of wild carrot is hemlock, which is what did Socrates in. It is superficially similar to a wild carrot. A wild carrot has little hairs along the stems, and its overall aspect is a little different. But and hemlock tends to have smooth stems and little purplish spots, particularly on the lower parts of the stems. It's a bigger plant that has more branching flower clusters coming off of it, but it is superficially similar. And there's some others that are like that. That it really, carrot family, leave it alone. You don't really need to deal with it. The exception that I really enjoy is wild parsnips. And if you get to upper part of Vermont and places like that, you see it quite often along roadsides and whatnot. Pretty easy to identify. You know you've got it from where it grows, how it looks, the whole thing, and that's a good one. So leave the carrot family alone unless you're really sure of yourself. Another family that I would leave alone would be the pea family, unless you're very comfortable with your identification. One of my favorite things to do when I was growing up in Connecticut was to collect beach peas, and that was perfectly safe. But vetches, which are very similar in aspect, they have perhaps smaller seeds and this and that, but they look like a pea. They're not necessarily something you want to try. They can create problems. Let's see, where am I here? Looking at my notes. So know where to let's talk about allergies. I've been kind of blessed. I don't seem to be allergic to anything. But I have heard reports that people have been allergic to things as safe seeming as, say, a hawthorn. If you're encountering a new plant that you've never tried before, it's always smart to take a little piece of it and put it on your tongue. Let it sit there for a half an hour or for a while, and then see if you react to it in a half an hour. If you don't react to it, then try eating a little bit of it. wait a half an hour. If you have no ill effects, then go ahead and try it. There aren't a lot of things that people are really allergic to like that. It's unusual, but there are things that people are allergic to. So it's always best to try things sparingly at first. So there's a 30-minute rule. Another thing to be aware of is where you're foraging. It's never really a great idea to forage right along the margins of a roadside. You're getting all sorts of contaminants that are going to get onto, whatever you're collecting. I mean, there are various degrees of that. You can, if you're on a really rural road out in the middle of nowhere, usually it's a better place to forage than a busy interstate, obviously. Let's see. The last little bit of business, well, a couple of bits. There are certain plants that are absolutely terrific. And it's something, but in quantity, they can cause problems. The perfect example of that are two plants that I like a great deal because they're kind of lemony, tart flavored, and they're very common. One is yellow wood sorrel, which has leaves that look like, it's a pale green, and the leaves look like shamrocks, and it has a 5-petaled yellow flower. The other one is sheep sorrel, which you can find in sort of poor fields. It has a little, how to describe it? The leaves are a little bit shaped like an arrowhead, but they're more elongated, more spear-like. And then its flowers are tiny. This is not a tall plant. Neither one of these are very tall plants. It has tiny, kind of reddish flowers when they're fully in bloom, on a very narrow little spike, with a little, you'll know it. Just and the problem with oxalic acid, it's the same thing that's in rhubarb, and it's why we peel rhubarbs. It's the stems, that is, and it's why it's best not to make a steady diet of rhubarb, because it contains the oxalic acid, and in too much quantity, it can cause issues. Now, having said that, one of the things that can cause issues is onions. If you eat too many onions, you inhibit the absorption of iron by the body. Usually we don't get to that point with any of these things. Be aware of the things that might cause allergic reactions that are fairly prevalent out there, and certainly know how to identify. I mean, these are common sense things. Know how to identify poison ivy. If you're going into a swampy, wooded area, know how to identify poison sumac. If you're foraging in tall grass or almost anywhere, be aware of ticks and Lyme disease. Tuck your socks in your pants. You can always put a rubber band to make things tight. Spray it a little bit with insect repellent, and you're good to go. Wash everything. So no matter where you're collecting, it's always a good idea to wash what you collect. So other things to know. Be aware of the laws in your area. I mean, this is common sense. Know that if you're collecting on somebody else's property, you need to ask permission, and most people are very happy to do so. I've had some odd experiences where my first one was kind of a shock. I was in a very rural part of West Virginia. The only way into this little town, and the town was basically just a bar upstairs and a grocery store downstairs, one building. And I was mistaken for a revenuer. And so basically when I started collecting things by the roadside, some guy showed up with a shotgun, convinced that I was up to no good. But, a little bit of conversation, and all of a sudden everything was wonderful. He was giving me tips. So always ask permission of property owners. Some places it's illegal to collect roadside flowers. Texas is a good example, so be aware of your local laws. Sometimes local, towns will have special prohibitions. National parks and state parks are places that foraging is not necessarily allowed. And so you should always ask if you're thinking about doing something in those areas. There is an etiquette and a set of ethics to go with collecting foraging. The basic one is, and again, this is common sense, only collect what you need. Do not strip everything from one single plant. Always leave something there by way of fruit, nuts, flowers, leaves. So it helps ensure the continuation of that particular species. Don't collect all the plants from one small area. Spread it out. Just pick your spots. Don't collect in habitats that are really susceptible to disturbance. Good examples of that are sand dune areas, of course. The more you trammel the dunes, the more you break it down, and the more erosion will occur during storms. One of my favorite places to forage or collect is in sphagnum bogs. There's some wonderful bogs in both Rhode Island and Maine that I've collected in that basically had floating mats. So you're actually walking on the top of the water on a mat of sphagnum and cranberry and blueberries and this and that. And the whole thing rocked like a waterbed. A wonderful place to collect, but it's also a place that's susceptible to damage. Another favorite situation for me are the mature woods in the spring. There are a whole host of plants that are available at that time to collect if you were so inclined. I mean, everything from toothworts to spring beauties to trout lilies or erythronium to it goes on and on and on. But it's a habitat that's pretty susceptible to disturbance. It's a habitat that is in mature woods for a very reason. It's because the soil has not been turned and there's a nice deep layer of humus. You can be proactive in all this too. And it's something I try to do, but it doesn't necessarily work out all the time. And that is to, if you can, and it's the right time of year, collect the seeds of some of these things and scatter them about as you go. Just help things further on. So that's etiquette. And so once you've learned how to be safe and you've learned how to obey the law and have come up with ethics and etiquette to follow, what do you need by way of equipment? Again, it's pretty common sense. You need a basket, is a handy thing to have. I tend to use gallon size plastic bags, but it probably might be better in a lot of cases to use paper bags to collect things. Basically, you need a digging tool if you're thinking about coming up with parsnips along the road. And my wife and I do a certain amount of gardening. We have what we call our favorite, it's the favorite tool. And the favorite tool is this tool. It's a hand mattock. There's a company it's actually Japanese made, but there's a company up in Canada called Lee Valley that sells these things. So that's my favorite tool. So I never go without that. I never go without a pocket knife. I usually go, if I remember it, a pair of small, kitchen shears or just scissors to do things. And I always go, well, there's the usual things of, again, wear a hat, take your sunscreen, all those things. But I usually go with a walking stick of some kind. It can be just an alpenstock, or it can be a walking stock that has a crook on the top. There's a given in collecting wild fruits, and that the sweetest fruit are always up higher. And so it's a handy thing to have to pull things down to get within your reach. Have a nice heavy pair of gloves. There are a bunch of things. One of my favorite things to collect is wrinkled rose, Japanese rose. It's forget the species name, but you find it in dune areas up in Maine. You find it here and there. It has very big rose hips, and they make great jelly. But to deal with the thing is it's loaded with thorns, and to deal with it, you really need some gloves to get in there and get to things. If you're dealing with things like hawthorns and all those sort of things, you want some covering. So gloves are handy. Let's see. So I've already mentioned that these things are ephemeral. It was one of the things that I loved about growing up in Connecticut. My mother used to take me to a local orchard, a place called Scott's Orchard, and we'd buy fresh fruit for the most part, but also asparagus and this and that. And there was a very definite season to things. It's one of the sad end products of modern grocery stores is that basically you can get asparagus all year round, virtually. Some of it's coming from South America. It's been sitting around for a while. There was something wonderful about having to wait to treat myself to strawberries or blueberries, or it had a definite season, and it made the taste all that much sweet. So that's one of the benefits of foraging. So let's see here. So what are my recommendations? Actually, I really recommend yellow wood sorrel and sheep sorrel. They make great garnishes in salads. They're a great addition to salads. We have something that's available now when there are warm spells in the winter, at least the early part of the winter, and then coming out of the winter, we have something called common chickweed. It's Stellaria media, I think. And it's very prolific. It grows in clumps. It's very common. It's very mild. I have never been that fond of things that are bitter. And so it's one of those things I love adding to salads because it adds bulk to the salad without too strong a flavor. So chickweed is one of those things I recommend. There's a whole group of plants that I really love. And they tend to be early season plants, and they go, into the late spring, but basically they're spring plants, and it's the mustard family. Anything that's a mustard is edible. They all taste vaguely of watercress. Some of them may have a little bit of bitterness to them, but not many. I mean, they're just wonderful things. A mustard family plant, to give you an idea, I mean, watercress, of course, but also something like broccoli is a mustard family plant. So you can use the leaves when they're tender, which is almost always. You can use the flower buds when they come in, and you can use the flowers themselves, which are either white or yellow. They're four-petaled. The leaves are always somewhat very lobed. It's a fabulous plant, or a group of plants to add to salads. We have one that's very common here, and actually I was collecting it just about 3 or 4 days ago, even when it was cold. We were down near a stream here, and there was a disturbed area where something it's called Pennsylvania bittercress. And it's another mustard. It has tiny white flowers, four-petaled. It has those wonderful leaves that taste of watercress, and it forms clumps sometimes. And I was collecting from a clump that was probably a foot across and probably 6 or 7 inches high, which is somewhat unusual. Usually it's more scattered than that. But that's another great early season plant that if you come across it, you just add it to a salad. So there are 2 different ways to approach foraging. One is you can go out there and seek things, which is always kind of problematic. If you're in the right time of year, it makes good sense. I mean, if I'm at 4th of July, I know that wineberries are ripe where I am here in Pennsylvania, and I go collecting wineberries. A little bit later, I'll go out, not much later, but I'll go out and I'll collect another raspberry, which is a native one called black raspberry, and that's out there. I know that the tail end of spring for me, the thing that indicates the end of the spring, is when the black locust comes into bloom. The whole plant is poisonous. The least poisonous plant, the part of this plant are the blossoms, and you can make fritters using the blossoms that taste like it smells. I mean, you're not going to make meals out of this thing, but it is one of those sources of wonder. Wisteria is like the same sort of thing, where so much of it is poisonous, but the flowers are not much by way of being poisonous and fun to try. So one of the things that you will see a lot along the roadsides, particularly fields that are poor and they're starting to go through the successional sequence from going towards a forest. But the first shrubs that'll come in will be things like sumac and staghorn sumac, which has those clusters, tight clusters of red berries, makes a wonderful lemonade. You can tell whether you want to gather it before you get a heavy rain, but you'll know it's good to go if you touch your tongue to the berries and it's tart. And it's an easy thing to prepare. You don't use hot water because you don't want to have the milky sap get into the water, because that's very bitter. You use cold water. The tart part of the hairs on the fruit dissolve very readily and goes into the water, and then you just add a little bit of honey or sugar to taste, and you've got lemonade. And let's see, a group of plants that probably you should keep your eyes open for, because they're pretty much everywhere, are the mints. And mints are always identified by square stems, opposite leaves, and then what are called lipped flowers. So they'll have a top and a bottom lip. If you crush the leaves and it smells like a mint, whether spearmint, peppermint, any mint, it's edible, and they make great teas, of course. Things like roses, crab apples, hawthorns, all make wonderful jellies. Things like cattails, which you can gather at any time of year, but are best from the fall to spring. There's an underground stem to the plant, and that's how it spreads, is with this underground stem that has roots coming off of it. If you crush that underground stem, the rhizome, it'll be slippery with starch. And the deal is you wash off the roots, then you crush them in cold water. That starch will dissolve into the water. You let it settle to the bottom, pour off the water, add more water, stir it up, then pour off the water until it's clean. The water is clean. The flour can be used in just about anything. It doesn't have the cohesion that you get with various plants that have gluten in them. And so you want to, generally I tend to add half and half wheat flour to cattail flour just to make my recipes easier. probably the thing that I had the most fun doing, other than collecting wild rice in a marsh. The thing that I had the most fun doing was wading through a cattail marsh and collecting the pollen from the tops of the catkins when they were sort of golden yellow into a paper bag, and then sifting that to get all the fluff out of it, and then using the flour to make various muffins and this and that. It's kind of an odd, strong flavor, hard to describe, but it's full of vitamins and so forth. And the thing that I really liked about it was not so much the pollen that I collected; it was seeing what insects were in the marsh, just seeing what turned up. It was just a wonderful way to see things. And I'd always see marsh wrens or red-winged blackbirds nesting, and it was just neat. So I recommend that. I really recommend. Unfortunately, you all are probably a bit more north than you need to be. One of my favorite fruits is persimmons. If you've never had wild persimmons, ripe wild persimmons, it's just wonderful. They make the best nut breads in the world. So wild persimmons. And then I mentioned pawpaws before. We have down here on the Susquehanna River, we have a dam called the Conowingo Dam. And just below the dam is a viewing area for people who want to go fishing, or they want to view the bald eagles that roost in all the towers for the electrical lines. But also in the hillside there, right on the parking lot, right going down to the parking lot, it's loaded with pawpaws. And as I say, in early October, that's one of my pilgrimages, is to go to the Conowingo Dam and collect pawpaws. Matter of fact, you can't really see it, but I've got this disgusting looking thing here, which is actually pawpaw seeds. Kind of mummified right now. But it's pawpaw seeds that I collected the last time I collected pawpaws, and have set them aside, and I'm about to dig them into the ground and see if I can get some pawpaws growing right around where I am right now. When we still had our farm, we did it on the farm, and it worked like a charm. So I'm looking forward to trying it again. So I should probably open this up to questions. I meant to time myself on this thing so I didn't go too long, and I probably have. So who has questions? Don't be in a hurry here. Just raise that hand. No questions? Is everyone muted?
Well, there's one question on the chat here. Where do pawpaws grow in New Jersey? I thought they were mostly in the southeast U.S.
We have them here, right around us. We're near Kennett Square. We're southeastern Pennsylvania. But yeah, you're right. They're more southerly. I mean, if you were along the Potomac River down in near Washington, you'd see piles of pawpaws. Along the Susquehanna, actually, the Susquehanna River is kind of wonderful. They have a state park, and its big visual shows are an old canal that they constructed that is just in from the river. That they use to take things up to where they constructed the dam. There's also an old stone mill that's still operating for grinding things. But also, the park is a reserve for pawpaws. It's actually not so much the pawpaws, but it's a reserve for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. And the pawpaws are the preferred food of zebra swallowtails. And so here's this park that's designated a sanctuary for zebra swallowtails. And it's because of all the pawpaws that are along the banks coming down towards the river. I see pawpaws all the time when I drive down towards Harper's Ferry and cross into Virginia and then back into West Virginia. It's loaded with pawpaws in there as well. So you are right. It's more of a southern thing. You have to have that southern influence I'm smiling actually because we used to live in Louisiana and we considered anything north of Baton Rouge to be the North. And the comment was, "Oh, they're all Baptists up there," and they were all Catholics in New Orleans practically. So North and South is kind of relative, and so you get tongues of southerly or southern influenced things that'll go fairly far north. So you will get pawpaws up as far as the Finger Lakes in New York State. They may not be as common as further south, but they're there. So another question? So one of the things that I really got into over the last 10 years or so was collecting black walnuts. And they're kind of a pain to pick the nut meats out of the walnuts. Their only saving grace is they're very common. And it's easy to get the husk off. You just dry it and then basically rub it off. Wear gloves, by the way. And then I've got this very fancy nutcracker that a Mennonite down in Virginia made. There's a very long lever on it. And so I crack these things open, get the nut meats. And then basically, again, I make nut breads with it. And actually even more than that, I make cookies with black walnuts. It's a very odd flavor to me. It's almost petroleum-based flavor to it. And my initial reaction to it was no. And then down the line, I started really kind of liking it. It's what happens sometimes is that there are flavors that we don't encounter very often that are worth experiencing. Maybe not worth repeating, but worth experiencing. I had a passing thought, but now I've lost it. So are there more questions?
Got a question here in chat. How about spice bush?
Yeah, I really haven't used it that much, and I should. It's pretty easy to identify. All you have to do is crush a twig, and it has a very distinctive odor to it. Basically, you can use it as an allspice substitute. And I don't know why I've never really done much with it, but I haven't done much with it. So I'm not a real aficionado on spice bush, but it is technically an edible plant that can be used. Seasoning. Okay.
This is Karen. I just wonder if you had any have tried to grow persimmon trees from seed.
Successfully, yes.
Okay. Do you have any hints?
Well, persimmon is one of those things. Well, my experience with persimmon is when I first encountered the persimmon trees. No, I really don't have. I don't know is the deal with persimmons. The persimmons that we had on our farm were basically things like Meadow persimmons. They were off of a rootstock and they were cultivated American persimmons. Either Meadow or Proc or this or that. What I found with persimmons, yeah, I'm not sure. They spread doing root sprouts, and so I can't remember whether I buried a lot of persimmons, hoping that the squirrels and whatnot wouldn't dig them up. Whether they came in, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I wish I did. It'd be interesting to know. But again, if you hit a persimmon that's producing great fruit, just collect some of the seeds. What you'll have to do is get the aril, the covering off the seed, so that it once you plant it, it will soak up moisture and germinate. If you don't take the aril off, it'll take a lot longer. my experience with pawpaws was my big foray into propagating, a tree from seeds. When I did the pawpaws, I planted about 100 of these. I had 100 pots outside my barn that didn't do a blessed thing. I did all the things you should do, got the arrow off, did this and that, planted these things, and nothing happened until about 60 to 90 days later. All of a sudden, something happened. It takes them a while to get their act together. And once they did, it was just great.
I'll give it a try with the persimmons.
Yeah, I mean, I gathered persimmons here where we are on this property this fall, making various things, and there were a lot of seeds, and we have some forest edges that I wanted to, and some areas where we had black walnuts that don't actually kill persimmons, and so I planted a bunch in the ground, but I have no idea whether it was successful or not.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, my advice on that is to put them in pots.
Okay.
And then see what happens. All right.
I'll give it a try. Thank you.
Well, good luck.
Thanks.
I don't know if you have success. Let me know.
I will.
I left with Rich. I left the my email address, and just send me a message.
Okay. Thanks.
You're welcome. There's a history to things. Getting back to the fact that there's so many wild edible plants and edible plants that we have gone into disfavor. There's so many things that have kind of a history. One of my favorite odors is the odor of wintergreen. I grew up in New England, and in New England you have lots of black birches, and black birches, if you crush the twig, it smells of wintergreen. There is a berry that you can find in sphagnum bogs up north. It's well, the only name I know it by is kind of obscure. It's called moxie plum. Oh, I know what it is. It's creeping snowberry, and it grows. It's tiny little leaves that smell of wintergreen, but it grows right along the top of the sphagnum, and it has little white berries that also smell of wintergreen. It's one of those wonderful things that you come across and say, wow. Moxie, there used to be a soft drink before the era of Coca-Cola called Moxie. That's where that expression, having Moxie, comes from, that soft drink that was produced initially using snowberries, or using the Moxie plums. There's just all sorts of things like that crop up when you do this. The other thing I discovered doing this foraging was that oftentimes you would encounter people who would, they'd ask you, well, what are you doing? And all of a sudden they'd start sharing experiences from their childhood or adulthood. Odd connections. It's the same way that bird watchers connect when they come across one another out in the wild. It's just fun.
You said you were going to comment about vitamins later.
Oh, what was I going to say? I've lost that thread. Probably. Oh, I know what was passing through. I mean, I told you that basically you do get this diminishment of the vitamin content of various things when it sits there on the shelf in a grocery store and whatnot. The other thing that takes away vitamins and nutritive value, but particularly vitamins, is cooking, is boiling. I tend to favor things that I tend to like salads. I tend to shy away. Obviously, I told you before, I don't like things that are bitter, and anything that requires you to boil and throw off the water, boil and throw off the water to sort of diminish the bitterness, also diminishes the value of the thing. So things like that I tend to sample, but don't do on a regular basis, because basically you've lost an awful lot of the sugars and the vitamins involved. So Coke is one of those things that I tend not to use that much. That's one of the reasons, is that you tend to have to throw off cooking waters. So I hope that was the thing I forgot about vitamins, but I'm sure there was something else too. I am now done.
Lee, thank you so very much. We always enjoy listening to you, and just so much of your personality comes through, and your obvious enjoyment of what you do and talk about. So thank you again.
So let me leave you with one story about foraging. We moved to a new place a couple of years ago, and the first spring, I decided, well, I'm going to look, and it's a 500-acre plot of land, basically. And I decided that I was going to go looking for morels on this property. And I looked everywhere. I mean, any kind of situation I could think of. And we have some pretty wonderful mature woods. We have some great old orchards. We have this and that and so forth and so on. And no luck whatsoever. And just about 100 feet behind our house, that's where I found morel mushrooms. So when you forage, it's sort of in the lap of the gods. You're never quite sure you're going to find the thing that you're looking for. I tend to be, I mean, there's certain things that you can spot from a prior year. A good example of that would be stinging nettles. You can spot a patch of stinging nettles when they're more mature than you'd want to use them, but you remember the spot and you go back there the next spring as they're just coming up and ideal. And that goes for a lot of things. I know the other thing I was thinking of, there are certain plants that are invasive that, my God, we should eat these things. A really good one, if you are in mind to try to diminish the population, and please don't throw out the seeds to increase the population, and that would be garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is an incredibly invasive plant in this area of Pennsylvania. I'm not sure about your area. And garlic mustard is, as the name says, it's somewhat garlicky. It's somewhat mustardy in flavor. It makes great pesto. It's something I didn't know when I put the book together years ago. I didn't know about garlic mustard, but it's like kudzu. If you can't beat it, eat it. And so if you have a chance, try garlic mustard. You can find recipes for garlic mustard pesto online. Now, having said that, there is a caveat, which is anytime you put pine nuts and basil in something, it's going to taste great. So there you are. But you should try it. Okay, that's it. Now I'm done.
Thanks again, Lee. We hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
And I think we've all learned a lot from you.
Well, it may be more information than you wanted, but there you are. Good night, everybody.
Good night, and
So
thank
long.
you again.
You're welcome.